The Ashworth Manor gleamed with festive brilliance as snow fell thick and silent beyond its Gothic windows. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing light across mahogany panelling, and the grand staircase was draped with garlands of holly and gold ribbon. Yet beneath the seasonal splendour, a darkness had taken root. It was Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth who discovered the theft at midnight on Christmas Eve. She had retired to her dressing room to admire, once more, the legendary Crimson Star, a ruby the size of a quail's egg, mounted in platinum and surrounded by flawless diamonds. The jewel had been in her family for 3 generations, worn only on the most significant occasions. Tonight, it had graced her neck throughout the evening's elaborate dinner party. Now, as she reached for the velvet case on her mahogany dresser, her breath caught in her throat. The case lay open, but empty. The ruby was gone. Within minutes, the household erupted into controlled chaos. Lord Ashworth summoned the servants. His daughter, Catherine, pale and trembling, sat in the drawing-room. The 5 dinner guests, a retired colonel, a society painter, a wealthy industrialist, a young actress, and a mysterious antiquarian dealer from abroad, were confined to their rooms by Lord Ashworth's orders. The manor's front gates were locked. No one had left. No one could leave. The local constable arrived within the hour, a well-meaning but distinctly ordinary man named Inspector Webb. He examined the dressing-room with methodical incompetence, noting the locked windows, secured from within, and the single door that opened directly into the master corridor. No signs of forced entry. No disturbance to surrounding items. Only the absence of the ruby. Yet it was the peculiar clue that troubled Inspector Webb most. Beside the empty case lay a single object, a child's wooden toy soldier, no more than 3 inches tall, painted in faded red and blue. It bore no connection to anything, no relation to any guest, no significance to the Ashworth family that could be immediately determined. It was simply there, deliberately placed, as if left by the thief as a calling card, or perhaps a cruel mockery. Extraordinary, Webb muttered, turning the figure over in his hands. A toy soldier. What in God's name does it mean? Lord Ashworth's frustration mounted. The investigation seemed to lead nowhere. The servants had all been accounted for. The guests had remained in the dining hall until nearly 11 o'clock, and Mrs. Ashworth herself had worn the necklace until she retired at midnight. Mere minutes separated the last sighting from the discovery of the theft. The timeline was impossibly compressed. The locked room offered no explanation. The window sashes were painted shut, untouched for months. The door had been monitored. And yet the ruby had vanished, leaving only a mysterious wooden soldier in its place. A clue that seemed designed to confound rather than illuminate. By 2 o'clock in the morning, Inspector Webb stood defeated in the drawing-room, his notebook filled with contradictions and impossibilities. The crime appeared simultaneously too simple to warrant such elaborate security precautions, and yet impossibly complex given the actual circumstances. The thief had to be among the locked group, staff or guest, and yet no motive, method, or opportunity aligned. It was then that a telegram arrived, dispatched from London by Lord Ashworth's solicitor. Help was coming. A Belgian detective of international renown had agreed to arrive by morning train. His name was Hercule Poirot, and his little grey cells had unravelled far more perplexing mysteries than this. The case awaited his arrival. The morning train from London arrived precisely at 9 o'clock. Hercule Poirot descended from the first-class carriage with deliberate grace, his patent leather shoes gleaming despite the snow. He was a man of meticulous appearance, his moustache waxed to geometric perfection, his tweed suit immaculate, his walking stick polished to a mirror shine. Yet it was his eyes that commanded attention, dark, penetrating, alive with an intelligence that seemed to catalogue and analyse everything they perceived. Lord Ashworth met him at the manor's entrance with barely concealed desperation. The crime had already begun to attract unwanted attention. Journalists circled the gates like vultures. The local police remained baffled. The household existed in a state of tense suspension, with servants whispering and guests growing increasingly hostile to their confinement. Poirot listened to the particulars with his head tilted slightly, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He asked few questions initially, preferring to absorb the narrative without interruption. When Lord Ashworth finished, Poirot simply nodded and requested to examine the dressing room undisturbed. The room revealed itself as a study in contradictions. Everything spoke of wealth and order, the polished furniture, the arranged cosmetics, the silk cushions on the velvet chair. Yet something about the space felt theatrical, as though carefully staged. Poirot moved with unhurried precision, his eyes missing nothing. He examined the empty jewel case, noted the exact position of the wooden soldier, tested the window latches, and studied the door frame with particular attention. It was then that Poirot's gaze fell upon something that had escaped every other observer, a barely visible mark on the carpet near the dressing table's left edge. Not a stain, but rather a slight discoloration, as though something heavy had rested there recently and been hastily removed. Poirot knelt, his immaculate trousers brushing the floor, and examined the mark with a magnifying glass he produced from his pocket. Interesting, he murmured to himself in his precise Belgian accent. Most interesting indeed. Downstairs, Poirot requested to interview each person individually. Inspector Webb prepared the morning room, uncomfortable with the Belgian's methods, but bound by protocol to cooperate. The interviews began methodically, the retired colonel stiff and proper, claiming to have retired early. The society painter, nervous and evasive. The industrialist, wealthy and indignant at the suggestion of suspicion. Yet it was the antiquarian dealer, a thin, angular man named Viscount Marlowe, whose reaction caught Poirot's attention most acutely. When asked about the wooden soldier, Marlowe's hand trembled slightly as he lifted his teacup. His eyes flickered toward the window, then back, a fraction of a second's hesitation before he claimed never to have seen such an object before in his life. Poirot noted this with the precision of a surgeon noting a patient's irregular heartbeat. Catherine Ashworth, the young daughter, proved similarly troubling to Poirot's observations. Her composure was almost too perfect, her alibi too precise. She had been in the parlour with the actress until midnight, she claimed, then retired directly to her room. Yet when Poirot casually mentioned that Mrs. Ashworth had worn the ruby throughout dinner, Catherine's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. By afternoon, Poirot had gathered sufficient preliminary observations. He stood in the library, gazing into the fireplace, his mind clearly working through invisible threads of connection. Inspector Webb hovered nearby, awaiting direction. "The crime," Poirot said quietly, without turning from the flames, "is not what it appears to be. Someone has lied, certainly. Someone has deceived. And yet the wooden soldier remains the crucial puzzle, the one clue the thief believed necessary to leave behind. Why would one do such a thing, Inspector Webb? Why deliberately provide a mystery within the mystery?" He turned then, his keen eyes fixed on Webb, with an expression of satisfied anticipation. Inspector Webb's face flushed with a mixture of confusion and mild offence. "A mystery within the mystery, Monsieur Poirot?" "I confess I don't follow your reasoning. Surely the toy soldier is simply a red herring, a distraction the thief left to confound the investigation." "Perhaps," Poirot replied, moving toward the leather wingback chairs near the window. "Or perhaps it is the most truthful thing about this entire affair. But come, we shall hear what the suspects themselves have to say. Their voices will tell us what their eyes attempt to conceal." The interviews resumed with renewed intensity. Poirot himself conducted them now, with Webb relegated to taking notes. The retired Colonel, General Harrington, proved his first subject of deeper examination. The old soldier sat rigidly, his military bearing impeccable. Yet Poirot noticed how his fingers drummed an irregular rhythm against his thigh when questioned about his movements after dinner. "You retired early, you say?" Poirot asked, his tone conversational rather than accusatory. "At precisely what hour, General?" 10:30, perhaps 11 o'clock, Harrington replied, then immediately corrected himself. "Closer to 10:30, I should think. These old bones require rest." "Yet Mrs. Ashworth states the dinner concluded at nearly 11, Poirot observed mildly. "How curious that you departed before the gathering itself dispersed." Harrington's jaw tightened. "I didn't say I left immediately. I meant I retired to my room shortly after. One can sit alone in one's quarters without advertising the fact." The contradiction hung in the air, unresolved but noted. Poirot moved on to the society painter, a Bohemian gentleman named Adrian Voss, whose studio in Kensington was known for its excess and artistic temperament. Voss's account of the evening was remarkably detailed. Too detailed, Poirot observed. He described conversations, gestures and expressions with an artist's precision. Yet, when asked a simple question about the colour of the drawing-room curtains, he hesitated, then offered an incorrect answer. "You describe the evening with such eloquence, Monsieur Voss," Poirot noted, "and yet you cannot recall so simple a detail as the curtain's hue. How fascinating that memory should be so selective." Voss laughed nervously. "An artist's mind, monsieur. We remember what interests us. Faces, expressions, drama. Curtains are merely backdrop." The industrialist, Charles Pemberton, proved an entirely different challenge. He was forthright to the point of hostility, claiming to have spent most of the evening discussing business matters with Lord Ashworth in the study. When Poirot asked if anyone could verify this claim, Pemberton's confidence wavered minutely. Lord Ashworth himself, naturally, he said, but the hesitation was there, buried beneath the bluster. It was the antiquarian dealer, Viscount Marlowe, whose second interview proved most revealing. Poirot approached him with disarming gentleness, as though they were merely discussing academic matters rather than investigating theft. "You collect antiquities, I understand," Poirot began. "Curious objects from forgotten eras. Toys, perhaps? Soldiers from centuries past?" Marlowe's composure fractured visibly. "I collect many things, monsieur. But I hardly see the relevance." "The relevance," Poirot interrupted softly, "is that a man of your expertise would recognise a child's toy soldier immediately. Yet you claim to have never seen one before. Why would you lie about such an insignificant matter?" Marlowe rose abruptly. "I want my solicitor present before answering further questions." Finally came Catherine Ashworth. She entered the room with practised composure, yet Poirot detected the tension beneath her composed exterior. Her dress was impeccable, her hair perfectly arranged, and yet her fingers twisted together in her lap, a gesture of anxiety no amount of poise could entirely suppress. When Poirot asked her to describe her exact movements between dinner's end and midnight, Catherine's account matched her earlier statement precisely. Too precisely. The words came in the same order, with identical phrasing, as though rehearsed. "Tell me, Miss Ashworth," Poirot said quietly, "why does one memorise an account of one's own evening? Surely genuine memory requires no such preparation?" Catherine's eyes widened, betraying her first authentic emotion. In that moment, Poirot saw the truth written plainly. She was protecting someone, and that protection required deception. Catherine's composure crumbled like aged parchment. Her face flushed crimson, and tears threatened to spill from her carefully guarded eyes. Poirot, observing this transformation, made no move to press further. Instead, he rose from his chair and walked to the window, allowing the young woman space to compose herself, without the burden of his penetrating gaze. "Your mother's ruby," Poirot said conversationally, as though discussing the weather, "is insured, I presume?" Catherine's voice emerged barely above a whisper. "Yes, for £50,000. A substantial sum, and the Ashworth family's circumstances, are they prosperous, or have recent investments proven troublesome?" The silence that followed answered more eloquently than any words. Poirot turned from the window to face her directly. "Your father has gambling debts, does he not? Rather significant ones. I observed his hands this morning, the tremor of a man under considerable financial strain. The kind of strain that might drive a man toward desperate measures." Catherine's tears now flowed freely. Father would never steal from mother. Never. But he needed money desperately. His debts to various unsavoury individuals had become dangerous. When the insurance company learns of the theft, they will pay out the full amount. Father intended to use the money to satisfy his creditors and preserve the family's reputation. Admirable intentions, Poirot acknowledged, but requiring the theft itself to appear genuine. Hence your false alibi. You covered for someone, but not your father, I think. Someone else entirely. Catherine hesitated, her loyalty warring with her conscience. Poirot seated himself once more, his expression gentle but inexorable. "The actress," he said quietly. "Miss Eleanor Stone. She required money as well, did she not? Her theatrical career has stalled, and her circumstances are equally dire." The young woman's silence confirmed his deduction. Poirot leaned back, his fingers forming their characteristic steeple as he began assembling the puzzle's pieces. The actress had befriended Catherine during the dinner party, forming a convenient alliance. Together, they had orchestrated the theft, or so they believed. Yet something about this arrangement troubled Poirot deeply. He summoned Inspector Webb and requested that Eleanor Stone be brought for immediate interrogation. The actress arrived with theatrical indignation, her performance evident in every gesture. She denied all involvement, insisting she had spent the evening precisely as Catherine had described. Yet when confronted with Catherine's confession regarding their collaboration, Eleanor's facade wavered. "The girl is confused," Eleanor protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "I would never." "You would never steal a ruby?" Poirot interrupted. "And yet you required money urgently. Your landlord has threatened eviction. Your theatrical agent abandoned you last month. You are, by any reasonable assessment, desperate. The opportunity presented itself, and you seized it." Eleanor sank into a chair, defeated. "I only wanted to help Catherine. She was so worried about her father. When she suggested the plan that I could take the ruby and we would arrange for it to be recovered, I thought it harmless, an insurance fraud, nothing more. No one would be genuinely harmed." Yet even as Eleanor confessed, Poirot's expression remained troubled. He rose and paced the room, his mind evidently engaged in calculations beyond the simple facts before him. The wooden soldier remained unexplained. The mark on the carpet suggested something more complex than a straightforward theft, and Viscount Marlowe's nervous reaction to questioning hinted at depths yet unexplored. Insurance fraud is indeed the stated motivation, Poirot mused aloud. Catherine needed her father's debts resolved. Eleanor needed funds for her circumstances. A mutual arrangement, seemingly simple. Yet something refuses to align properly with this explanation. He turned to face both women with renewed intensity. Who suggested this scheme initially? Was it truly Catherine's plan? Or did someone else propose it? Someone with knowledge of the ruby, its value, and its vulnerabilities? Catherine and Eleanor exchanged uncertain glances. Finally, Catherine spoke hesitantly. It was Viscount Marlowe. He approached me at the dinner party and suggested that if I were concerned about father's situation, the ruby presented a perfect solution. He said he knew insurance fraud specialists who could facilitate the theft and recovery. He seemed to know everything about the necklace, its history, its exact value, even mother's insurance policy, details. Poirot's expression shifted into something approaching satisfaction. The true pattern was emerging from beneath the surface deceptions. This was no simple theft orchestrated by desperate women. This was something far more calculated, far more deliberate, and infinitely more dangerous than anyone had yet recognised. Inspector Webb seized upon the revelation with undisguised relief. Here, finally, was a clear culprit, a man of suspicious background, questionable credentials, and demonstrable knowledge of the crime's particulars. Within the hour, Viscount Marlowe was arrested and placed in police custody pending formal charges of theft and conspiracy. The local newspapers erupted with triumphant headlines. Jewel thief apprehended, they proclaimed. Belgian detective solves Christmas mystery in mere hours. Inspector Webb granted interviews with barely concealed satisfaction, crediting Poirot's assistance while subtly suggesting the Metropolitan Police could have reached the same conclusions given adequate time. Lord and Lady Ashworth received the news with visible relief. The scandal, though considerable, would be manageable with proper legal counsel and financial settlement. Catherine embraced her mother, tears streaming down her face, while Eleanor Stone signed a statement agreeing to cooperate fully with the authorities in exchange for lenient treatment. Yet Poirot accepted none of the accolades. He stood in the Manor's library late that evening, alone, staring into the dying fire with an expression of profound dissatisfaction. Inspector Webb found him there, his exhaustion evident in his posture. "Surely you must be pleased with the resolution, Monsieur Poirot," Webb ventured. "The guilty parties have been identified and apprehended. Justice will be served." Justice? Poirot's voice carried a note of melancholy. "Inspector, we have solved nothing. We have merely arrested the obvious suspect and accepted the confession of two desperate women. We have done exactly what the true architect of this crime anticipated we would do." Webb's confidence faltered. "I don't understand." Marlowe orchestrated the entire scheme. His knowledge of the ruby, his approach to Catherine, it all points clearly to his guilt. It points to his involvement, certainly, Poirot corrected, but not to the truth of the matter. Consider the timeline, Inspector. Marlowe arrived at the Manor only yesterday afternoon. How would a man of such recent acquaintance possess intimate knowledge of Lady Ashworth's insurance policies? How would he understand the precise architectural details of the dressing room, the locked windows, the daily routines of the household? The questions hung unanswered in the air. Webb opened his mouth to respond, but found himself unable to construct a coherent reply. Poirot continued, his voice taking on the tone of a man thinking aloud. "And the wooden soldier, this peculiar object that troubled you from the beginning. Marlowe could not identify it when questioned. Yet we are meant to believe this man orchestrated every detail of so complex a scheme? A man genuinely involved in planning such a crime would have explained the soldier's significance. Instead, he simply denied knowledge of it entirely." Webb's discomfort grew palpable. What are you suggesting, monsieur? I am suggesting, Poirot said quietly, turning from the fire to face the inspector directly, that Marlowe is a guilty man, but not guilty of this particular crime. He recognised an opportunity when Catherine confessed her concerns to him. Perhaps he hoped to manipulate the situation to his advantage, to establish himself as the orchestrator of a crime he did not commit. Or perhaps he was deliberately positioned to take the blame by someone far more intelligent and considerably more dangerous. The full implications of this statement began to dawn upon Webb's features. You mean to say the ruby is still missing? The theft was not what we believed? Precisely, Poirot affirmed. Marlowe has confessed to involvement, Catherine and Eleanor have provided circumstantial evidence, and the authorities have arrested a convenient scapegoat. But somewhere within this manor, the genuine thief remains at liberty, secure in the knowledge that the official investigation has concluded. The wooden soldier was left not as a calling card of guilt, but as a message from someone who knew exactly how this investigation would unfold. Webb's face paled as understanding crystallised. They had not solved the mystery at all. They had merely provided the perfect cover for a crime of far greater sophistication than anyone had yet comprehended, and the person responsible remained among them, waiting, watching, preparing for the moment when their true design would become apparent. Poirot's assertion sent Inspector Webb into a state of agitated confusion, yet the Belgian detective remained unmoved by the chaos his revelation had precipitated. Instead, he requested access to the manor's extensive library, and, more curiously, to Lord Ashworth's personal correspondence and financial records from the preceding decade. I require context, Poirot explained when questioned about this seemingly tangential request. The wooden soldier was not placed by accident or impulse. It was chosen with deliberate intention, which suggests personal knowledge, historical significance, perhaps even sentiment. Someone among us understands what this toy means, and the understanding connects directly to the true theft. While Webb supervised Marlowe's formal detention in the village constable's office, Poirot settled himself among Lord Ashworth's documents with methodical precision. Hours passed as he examined ledgers, letters and correspondence dating back 15 years. His little grey cells worked in characteristic silence, cataloguing connections invisible to ordinary perception. It was nearly midnight when he discovered it, a letter dated to 1910, written in a woman's careful script. The correspondent identified herself as Margaret Ashworth, Lord Ashworth's sister, and the letter detailed a family scandal of considerable magnitude. Young Charles Ashworth, the letter revealed, had been involved in a jewel theft from the British Museum. The crime had been covered up through family connections and financial settlement, but the shame had driven Margaret to exile herself in continental Europe under an assumed name. Poirot's expression shifted into something approaching recognition. He rose from the desk and summoned Lord Ashworth to the library immediately. The master of the manor arrived within minutes, his nightclothes hastily covered by a dressing gown, his expression wary. Poirot held the letter before him without preamble. "Your sister Margaret," Poirot said quietly, "the family scandal of 1910. Tell me, Lord Ashworth, did your sister have children?" Ashworth's face drained of colour. His hand trembled as he sank into the nearest chair. Margaret had one child, he admitted reluctantly. A son. But that was decades ago, before she disappeared into Europe. We lost contact with her entirely. My solicitors have been searching for her for years, hoping to reconcile the family breach, but she left no forwarding address. And this son, Poirot pressed, would be approximately 35 years of age now. Would he not, a man of considerable intelligence, educated abroad, perhaps with knowledge of antiquities and art? The awful realisation crystallised on Lord Ashworth's features. "Marlowe," he whispered. "Viscount Marlowe is Margaret's son. My nephew." Poirot nodded slowly. "Your nephew Yes, and a man who has inherited more than mere bloodline from his mother's family. The thirst for revenge, perhaps, or the desire to reclaim what he perceives as his rightful place. When your sister was forced into exile, she lost everything: her position, her inheritance, her very identity. Those losses would have festered across decades, passed from mother to son as a legacy of bitterness. The pieces now aligned with terrible clarity. Viscount Marlowe, or whatever his true name might be, had not arrived at Ashworth Manor by chance. He had orchestrated his own appearance at the Christmas gathering with calculated precision. His knowledge of the household, the ruby, the insurance policies, all derived from years of investigation into his estranged uncle's affairs. But there remains a crucial question, Poirot continued, his voice taking on renewed intensity. If Marlowe is merely a pawn in someone else's design, then who is the true architect? Who possesses the knowledge, the access, and the motivation to orchestrate this elaborate scheme with such sophistication? A knock at the library door interrupted the moment. Inspector Webb entered, his expression troubled. "Monsieur Poirot, we have a problem. The actress Eleanor Stone, she has disappeared from her room. When the constable brought her evening meal, he found the window open and the room abandoned." Poirot and Lord Ashworth exchanged glances laden with terrible significance. Eleanor Stone, the desperate actress, the seemingly minor player in the conspiracy, she had vanished, leaving behind neither explanation nor trace. And in her absence, the true pattern of the crime suddenly became visible, lurking beneath layers of deliberate deception, like a predator beneath dark water. Poirot's response to Eleanor's disappearance proved characteristically unconventional. Rather than ordering an immediate search or issuing arrest warrants, he calmly requested that every remaining occupant of Ashworth Manor be assembled in the drawing room within 30 minutes. Inspector Webb protested vehemently, but Poirot's authority proved unassailable. "The chase for Eleanor Stone will prove fruitless," Poirot stated with absolute certainty. "She has had hours to establish distance and concealment. Instead, we shall remain precisely where we are, and allow the truth to reveal itself through means more subtle than pursuit." When the assembled group gathered, Lord and Lady Ashworth, Catherine, General Harrington, Charles Pemberton, and Adrian Voss, Poirot positioned himself before them with theatrical deliberation. A small table had been placed at his side, upon which rested a leather journal and several photographs. "I have spent the afternoon examining Lord Ashworth's personal correspondence," Poirot began, "and I have discovered something quite remarkable. A letter from 1910, written by Margaret Ashworth regarding a family scandal. But there is more. Lord Ashworth has provided me with photographs of his sister Margaret from that era, before her exile." Poirot held up a sepia-toned photograph of a beautiful young woman with distinctive dark eyes and a particular turn of chin. "This is Margaret Ashworth as she appeared 50 years ago. Notice the distinctive features, the high cheekbones, the particular shape of the eyes, the small scar above the left eyebrow, barely visible but unmistakable to those trained to observe such details." The drawing room fell silent. Poirot's gaze swept across each face methodically, observing every micro-expression, every involuntary muscular response. It was Adrian Voss whose reaction proved most revealing. The society painter's hand froze halfway to his teacup, his eyes fixed upon the photograph with an intensity that transcended casual observation. More tellingly, his complexion shifted from its customary ruddy hue to a shade approximating parchment. "Monsieur Voss," Poirot said softly, "you have studied the human face for decades. You possess an artist's intimate knowledge of physiognomy. Tell me, what do you observe in this photograph?" Voss attempted to deflect with characteristic bohemian dismissiveness. "A woman of the past, Monsieur." What more can be said? Everything can be said, Poirot corrected, if one possesses the courage to speak truthfully. You recognise these features, do you not? Because you have observed them recently. In a much younger incarnation, the same eyes, the same cheekbones, perhaps even the same scar, cleverly concealed beneath theatrical makeup. The colour drained entirely from Voss's features. Lady Ashworth gasped, her hand moving to her throat. Poirot allowed the silence to extend for precisely the duration required for psychological impact before continuing. Eleanor Stone is not Eleanor Stone at all, is she, Monsieur Voss? She is Margaret Ashworth's daughter. Your daughter, in fact. The child Margaret bore before her exile, a child placed in your care all those years ago when she fled England to escape her family's condemnation. Voss rose abruptly, his composure shattering entirely. You cannot prove. I require no proof, Poirot interrupted. Your reaction has provided all the confirmation necessary. You have known Eleanor's true identity throughout this entire affair. You orchestrated her involvement, guided her movements, and ensured her escape when the investigation threatened exposure. More significantly, you were the architect of this entire scheme, were you not? The wooden soldier, that was your creation. Monsieur, a childhood toy you crafted for young Eleanor decades ago, left deliberately as a message only you and Margaret would comprehend. The full scope of the conspiracy now crystallised in terrible clarity. Adrian Voss had not merely been a passive participant in the theft. He had orchestrated every element with the precision of a master strategist. Eleanor's introduction into the household, Marlowe's convenient arrival, Catherine's concerns about her father's debts, all had been orchestrated to create the perfect conditions for a crime far more complex than any simple jewel theft. But the ruby itself, Poirot concluded, his voice steady and inexorable, that was never truly the objective, was it, Monsieur Voss? The theft was merely the mechanism through which you intended to accomplish something far more significant. A revenge decades in the making, rooted in the injustice Margaret suffered, and the separation from her daughter that resulted from her family's cruelty. Adrian Voss stood motionless, his artistic facade completely abandoned, revealing the cold calculation beneath. Yet before he could respond to Poirot's accusation, a commotion erupted from the Manor's entrance hall. Inspector Webb rushed into the drawing-room with alarming haste, his face flushed with agitation. "Monsieur Poirot," he gasped, "there has been a development. The constable guarding Viscount Marlowe reports that the prisoner has fallen gravely ill. The physician suspects poisoning. He is unconscious and may not survive the night." The implications of this development struck the assembled group with palpable force. Poirot's expression remained outwardly composed, yet his eyes narrowed with sharp intensity. He rose from his chair with deliberate grace and gestured toward Webb with quiet authority. "We must attend to the prisoner immediately," Poirot declared. The attempted murder of a man in police custody represents an escalation of considerable significance. However, before we depart, I require that no one leave this drawing-room. Inspector Webb, station constables at every exit. No one enters, no one departs, until I have returned. The journey to the village constable's office proved harrowing. Marlowe lay on a narrow cot, his breathing shallow and laboured, his skin taking on the waxy appearance of imminent death. The village physician stood helplessly beside him, having already exhausted the limited remedies available in such rural circumstances. "The poison is sophisticated," the doctor explained, his voice tight with professional frustration, not something acquired casually. Someone with considerable knowledge of toxicology administered this deliberately. The symptoms suggest aconite, perhaps combined with other alkaloids to accelerate the effect. Poirot examined Marlowe's lips and examined the remnants of the evening meal that had been brought to the prisoner. A small quantity of soup remained in the dish, innocuous in appearance, yet potentially deadly in composition. The constable on duty had been absent for precisely 12 minutes. He had been summoned to the manor to assist with Eleanor's disappearance, leaving the prisoner unattended. Who had access to the prisoner during those 12 minutes? Poirot inquired sharply. The constable's response came reluctantly. Only the cook who delivered the meal, Monsieur. She is part of the manor's household staff. She brought the soup at 7:30 as instructed. The pieces aligned with devastating clarity. Someone within Ashworth Manor possessed both the knowledge and the opportunity to poison Marlowe. Someone intended to silence him before he could provide testimony that might illuminate the conspiracy's full scope. The wooden soldier remained unexplained, the ruby's whereabouts unknown, and now the primary suspect lay dying, his secrets locked behind the veil of unconsciousness. Poirot returned to the manor with Inspector Webb, his mind clearly engaged in furious calculation. The drawing-room had been maintained exactly as he had left it, with constables positioned at every door. Yet something in the room had fundamentally changed. The leather journal and photographs that had rested on the side table were gone. Poirot's eyes swept across the space where they had been positioned. His expression hardened into something approaching fury, a rare display of emotion from the typically controlled Belgian detective. "The journal containing Margaret Ashworth's letter," he said quietly, "and the photographs that identified Eleanor Stone's true parentage. Both have been removed from this room while it was under police supervision. This represents not merely the destruction of evidence, but an act of deliberate sabotage against the investigation itself." Lord Ashworth rose from his chair in protest. "That is impossible, monsieur. Your constables have monitored every entrance. Have they?" Poirot interrupted, his tone sharp as a blade. "Or have they been strategically positioned to watch the obvious exits while overlooking passages less apparent to ordinary perception? This manor was constructed in 1847. Lord Ashworth, surely a man of your standing knows the architectural peculiarities of his own residence? The servants' passages, the connecting corridors, the hidden access points that Victorian architects so enjoyed incorporating?" Webb's face flushed with realization of his oversight. Yet Poirot's gaze had shifted toward Adrian Voss, who sat with studied composure, his fingers steepled in an unconscious mirror of Poirot's own habitual gesture. The question becomes not who removed the evidence, Poirot mused aloud, but who possessed sufficient knowledge of this manor's layout to accomplish such removal undetected. Someone intimate with its secrets. Someone who has spent considerable time within these walls, studying its architecture, its vulnerabilities, its hidden pathways. Someone, perhaps, who visited frequently over many years under the guise of artistic consultation or social engagement. The accusation hung unspoken yet unmistakable in the air between them. Adrian Voss did not attempt denial or escape. Instead, he rose slowly from his chair with an almost ceremonial deliberation, his demeanour transforming into something approximating theatrical resignation. His eyes fixed upon Poirot with an intensity that suggested respect mingled with defiance. "You are correct, monsieur," Voss acknowledged, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man surrendering to inevitability. "I have known the secrets of this manor intimately for nearly 30 years. I have walked its hidden passages, studied its architecture, understood its vulnerabilities. When Margaret came to me decades ago, broken and exiled, I became the guardian of her daughter. When Eleanor proved ready to execute justice against the family that destroyed her mother, I orchestrated every element with the precision of a master artisan." Inspector Webb stepped forward, his hand moving toward his truncheon, but Poirot raised a subtle gesture that halted the constable's advance. The Belgian detective remained perfectly still, his entire being focused upon the confession unfolding before him. "The ruby was never truly the objective," Voss continued, pacing the drawing-room with the fluid grace of a dancer. Though its acquisition served multiple purposes, the theft created the perfect mechanism through which to draw the family into a carefully orchestrated deception. The wooden soldier was Margaret's message to me, confirmation that Eleanor had successfully completed her role and secured her escape. But something has gone profoundly wrong, Poirot observed, his tone carrying neither accusation nor sympathy. Viscount Marlowe was poisoned. That was not part of your original design, was it? Someone else has intervened. Someone within this household who possesses motivations independent of your vendetta. The colour drained from Voss's face as the implications crystallised. He ceased his pacing and turned toward the window, his shoulders sagging with the weight of sudden comprehension. It was at that precise moment that a scream pierced through the manor's upper floors, a cry of such raw terror that it transcended gender and articulation, becoming purely a sound of anguish and fear. Inspector Webb and 2 constables bolted from the drawing-room toward the staircase, with Poirot following at a measured pace that belied the urgency of the situation. The scream had originated from Lady Ashworth's chamber. They found her standing in the centre of the room, her face ashen, her hand trembling as she pointed toward the open safe concealed behind a portrait of her ancestors. The safe hung open, its interior completely empty. "My jewels," Lady Ashworth gasped. "All of them. Gone. Someone has taken everything. The emeralds from my grandmother, the pearls from my wedding, the diamonds from my engagement ring. Everything of value. Everything that remained precious to me." Yet it was not the theft itself that concerned Poirot. His attention fixed upon a detail that others had overlooked. A second wooden soldier, identical to the first, positioned deliberately upon the dressing table. This one, however, bore a message written upon its back, in careful script. The debt is not yet settled. The child of Margaret Ashworth has taken what belongs to her by right. Poirot's expression shifted into something approaching grim recognition. He turned to face the assembled group, his voice carrying the weight of profound realisation. "We have been operating under a profound misapprehension," he declared quietly. "There are not 2 criminals orchestrating this affair, but 3. Adrian Voss represents one faction, a man devoted to Margaret's vindication and his foster daughter's escape. Eleanor Stone represents another, though her true objectives remain obscured beneath layers of deception. But the third conspirator, the one who has poisoned Marlowe and now orchestrated this secondary theft, remains unidentified. This person possesses intimate knowledge of the household's layout equal to Voss's own. This person understands the location of hidden safes and family secrets. This person, I suspect, is bound to the Ashworth family by blood or marriage." Catherine's voice emerged tremulously from behind them. "The cook, Monsieur. The cook who delivered Marlowe's poisoned meal. She has also disappeared. She left through the servants' passage not 5 minutes ago." Inspector Webb turned toward Poirot with desperate urgency. "What is happening here, Monsieur? How many conspirators are there? How many crimes are we investigating?" "We are investigating," Poirot replied with measured precision. "The manifestation of decades of accumulated resentment, carefully orchestrated betrayal, and the wages of familial cruelty. And unless we act with considerable speed and precision, there will be one more victim before this night concludes." The revelation struck Poirot with the force of a physical blow, yet he remained perfectly composed, his mind visibly engaging in the rapid reassessment of every prior observation. He closed his eyes for precisely 3 seconds, reconstructing the investigation's entire architecture in light of this new understanding. When he opened them again, absolute certainty resided in their depths. "The cook," Poirot said quietly, turning to address the assembled group. "Tell me, Lord Ashworth, how long has this cook been employed within your household?" Lord Ashworth hesitated, consulting with his wife through an exchange of troubled glances. "She arrived approximately 4 months ago," he replied uncertainly. "She came highly recommended through an employment agency in London. Her references were impeccable, years of experience in distinguished households." References that were fabricated, naturally, Poirot continued, just as Eleanor Stone's identity as an actress was constructed specifically to facilitate her insertion into your Christmas gathering. The cook represented phase 2 of a considerably more elaborate scheme than the initial theft itself. Inspector Webb stepped forward, his confusion evident. "But monsieur, surely the cook is merely Eleanor's accomplice in the poisoning and the secondary theft. She has fled to rejoin her confederate." "No," Poirot interrupted with uncharacteristic sharpness. "You perceive only the surface patterns, Inspector. You observe the obvious theft and assume a simple explanation. But consider the details we have overlooked in our fixation upon the ruby. The cook arrived 4 months ago. She has occupied a position of absolute trust within the household, with access to every chamber, every corridor, every secret. She has observed the daily routines, the guard schedules, the security measures. She has had opportunity to familiarise herself with the manor's architecture in ways that would require months of deliberate study." Catherine's voice emerged with sudden clarity. "The cook. She bears a remarkable resemblance to our housemaid from years past. Sarah, the girl who left our employ when I was perhaps 12 years old. Mother was never entirely clear about why she departed so abruptly, but I remember Father was extraordinarily angry about her leaving. The implications crystallised with terrible precision." Poirot's gaze shifted toward Lord Ashworth, whose complexion had begun to betray the guilty knowledge that his niece's observation had inadvertently exposed. "A housemaid who departed under circumstances you prefer not to discuss," Poirot stated, his tone carrying neither judgment nor sympathy. "A young woman who was perhaps not merely seeking employment elsewhere, a woman, perhaps, who was dismissed for reasons related to Margaret Ashworth's family situation. A woman who may have been present during the scandal of 1910? Lord Ashworth rose abruptly, his chair clattering backward. "This is intolerable. This is justice," Poirot interrupted calmly. "The cook is not Eleanor Stone's accomplice at all. She is Margaret Ashworth's other child, the daughter born after her exile, the child Margaret bore while living in continental obscurity. This woman has spent decades nursing her mother's wounds, hearing the stories of betrayal and abandonment, preparing herself for the moment when she could execute the final phase of vengeance." Adrian Voss's expression transformed into something approximating shock. "That is impossible," he whispered. "Margaret had no other children. She told me. She told you what she believed to be true," Poirot replied with surgical precision. "But a woman in exile, bearing children in secrecy, living under assumed identities, such a woman would not necessarily disclose all her circumstances, even to her most trusted confidant. The wooden soldiers were not merely messages between conspirators, they were tokens passed between two sisters, separated by circumstance and deception." Inspector Webb seized upon this revelation with desperate hope. "Then we must organise an immediate pursuit. The cook cannot have travelled far. If we mobilise the constables, she is not fleeing," Poirot said with absolute certainty. "She is executing the final phase of a plan conceived over decades. The poisoning of Marlowe was not random murder. It was silencing a man who might reveal Eleanor's identity and jeopardise her escape. The theft from Lady Ashworth's safe was not mere greed. It was the acquisition of portable assets that would facilitate Margaret Ashworth's own liberation from the continent, her return to England to witness her daughter's triumph. The terrible realisation dawned upon Lord Ashworth's features. "You believe Margaret Ashworth is here? Within the manor?" "I believe," Poirot corrected, "that Margaret Ashworth has been here all along, hidden in plain sight, protected by her daughters, waiting for the moment when every piece aligned precisely as intended. The Christmas gathering, the ruby theft, the involvement of Marlowe and Voss, all of it orchestrated to create sufficient chaos that her presence would pass entirely unnoticed, and the cook's disappearance signals not flight, but arrival. Margaret Ashworth is no longer concealed. She is moving toward her ultimate objective, confronting the family that destroyed her life 50 years ago. The manor erupted into controlled pandemonium. Inspector Webb issued orders for a systematic search of every chamber, every corridor, every conceivable hiding place within the sprawling estate. Constables moved through the hallways with urgent purposefulness, their footsteps echoing against stone and wood. Yet Poirot remained motionless in the drawing room, his expression suggesting that the frenetic activity surrounding him represented a profound misunderstanding of the situation's true nature. "They search in vain," he murmured to himself, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "They hunt for a woman who does not wish to be found by such crude means. But she does wish to be found by me, I think, by someone capable of understanding the depths of her motivation and the sophistication of her design." Lord Ashworth stood frozen, his body rigid with dawning comprehension of horrors long suppressed. His hands trembled as he addressed Poirot with the broken voice of a man confronting his own culpability across the gulf of 50 years. "The scandal," he whispered. "It was not Margaret who was guilty of theft. It was I who committed the crime. I took the jewels from the British Museum, but when discovery threatened, I allowed Margaret to bear the blame. My father arranged everything, the cover-up, the exile, the payment to silence the authorities. Margaret took the punishment that should have been mine. The confession hung in the air like a poison gas, seeping into every crevice of the room." Lady Ashworth's hand moved to her mouth, her expression contorting with the shock of revelation. Catherine sank into a chair, her comprehension of her father's moral character fundamentally fractured. "And there is more," Poirot said quietly, his tone carrying the weight of inexorable truth. "Is there not, Lord Ashworth? Margaret was not merely exiled. She was made to understand that if she ever attempted to reclaim her place, if she ever threatened the family's reputation or your position, her own children would be taken from her permanently. This threat, this deliberate separation of a mother from her offspring, represents a cruelty that transcends mere financial crime. It represents the weaponization of maternal love itself." The drawing-room door opened with dramatic suddenness. A woman entered, not the cook, but a figure of striking dignity despite her advanced age. Her face bore the unmistakable resemblance to the photograph Poirot had displayed hours earlier, yet decades of suffering had carved themselves into every line and shadow. Her eyes possessed the peculiar intensity of someone who has nursed a singular purpose across an entire lifetime. Margaret Ashworth stood before them, and in her hand she held a leather journal, the very document that had been removed from the drawing-room under police supervision. "The truth," she said, her voice carrying an accent touched by continental European residents, "has been concealed beneath layers of carefully constructed deception. My son," she glanced toward Adrian Voss with profound tenderness, "was not born to me during my exile. He was my youngest child, born before the exile itself, placed in Adrian's care when I was forcibly separated from my children. 50 years I have lived knowing my daughters existed somewhere in the world, knowing they had been taught to despise me as a criminal, knowing my grandchildren would inherit lies about my character." She opened the journal and held it toward Poirot. "This contains Margaret Ashworth's confession, not to the crime my brother committed, but to the psychological devastation of maternal separation. It details every day of grief, every moment of longing, every calculation I made toward this moment of reckoning. The ruby was never the objective. The theft itself was merely the mechanism through which to draw my family into circumstances where truth could finally emerge. Lord Ashworth attempted to rise, but his legs betrayed him, and he collapsed back into his chair. The weight of 50 years of accumulated guilt, finally released from the compartments where he had imprisoned it, overwhelmed his capacity for physical response. "The cook," Margaret continued, her gaze fixed upon her brother with an intensity that seemed to strip away every defence, "is my daughter Sarah. Born after my exile, raised knowing only that her mother had been deemed unworthy of maternal love. The poisoning of Viscount Marlowe was necessary to ensure his silence regarding Eleanor's identity. The theft from your safe was not greed, Charles. It was the reclamation of assets that rightfully belonged to my daughters. Compensation for the years of separation, the inheritance of shame, the stolen mother love that your cruelty denied them." Poirot stepped forward and accepted the journal from Margaret's hands with ceremonial reverence. He examined it with profound attention, his expression reflecting neither judgment nor approval, but rather the recognition of human complexity in all its devastating manifestations. "Justice," he said quietly, "is rarely as simple as the law would have us believe." Inspector Webb stood frozen, his official authority rendered meaningless by the psychological and moral complexity that had unfolded before him. He looked toward Poirot with desperate expectation, hoping the Belgian detective would provide clarity on how to proceed in circumstances that transcended ordinary criminal procedure. Poirot remained silent for a prolonged moment, his gaze moving methodically from Margaret Ashworth to Lord Ashworth, then to Adrian Voss, Catherine, and finally to the inspector himself. When he spoke, his voice carried the measured cadence of a man rendering judgment that extended far beyond legal categories. "The ruby," Poirot said quietly, "remains missing. The household has been thoroughly searched, yet no trace of the jewel has been discovered. This represents the final piece of the puzzle, the element that will determine whether this affair concludes as a crime to be prosecuted, or a tragedy to be acknowledged, and perhaps transcended." He turned to address Margaret directly, his expression reflecting neither condemnation nor sympathy, but rather a kind of philosophical recognition of human suffering, rendered visible through deliberate action. "Where is the Crimson Star, Madame Ashworth? You orchestrated its theft with such precision that its recovery seemed impossible. Yet I suspect it was never truly lost, merely relocated to a location where it would serve a purpose beyond its material value. Where have you hidden it?" Margaret's composure remained absolute. Yet her eyes, when they met Poirot's, betrayed something deeper than defiance, a kind of weary recognition that she was addressing someone capable of understanding her motivations without judgment. "The ruby is where it has always belonged," Margaret replied, her voice carrying the weight of careful deliberation. "In the possession of someone who understands its true significance, not as a gemstone, but as a symbol of the Ashworth family's capacity for cruelty and concealment. I gave it to Eleanor, along with her sister Sarah, not as stolen property but as evidence of their rightful inheritance, proof that they were never bastards or abandoned children, but daughters of one of England's most prominent families, kept hidden through deliberate deception and the weaponization of family shame." Lord Ashworth's voice emerged in broken syllables. "Eleanor and Sarah will use the ruby to claim legitimacy. They will expose the family scandal. The Ashworth name will be destroyed. Everything I have built upon the foundation of my crime will crumble." "As it should," Poirot interrupted, his tone carrying neither malice nor judgment. "You constructed your life upon a foundation of stolen justice. The building was always unstable, merely waiting for the correct pressure to collapse. Your daughters have merely provided that pressure. The question now becomes not whether exposure will occur, but how it will occur, and whether justice will take the form of legal prosecution or moral reckoning. Poirot gestured toward Inspector Webb with subtle authority. Inspector Viscount Marlowe remains in critical condition due to poisoning administered with considerable sophistication. The perpetrator of this attempted murder sits before us in this very room, though her motivations extended far beyond mere criminal impulse. The theft of the Crimson Star has been orchestrated by multiple conspirators, each with their own understanding of justice and vengeance. The theft from Lady Ashworth's safe represents the final statement in a narrative that began 50 years ago. Margaret stepped forward with deliberate composure. I will not attempt to flee, Inspector Webb. I am prepared to face whatever legal consequences my actions have engendered, but I ask, not as a plea for mercy, but as a matter of simple human dignity, that my daughters be granted the opportunity to establish their legitimacy and claim their rightful inheritance before prosecution commences. They have spent their entire lives bearing the shame of illegitimacy, when the true shame belonged to their uncle all along. Lord Ashworth rose from his chair with evident effort, his body bent beneath the weight of accumulated guilt. His voice, when he spoke, emerged as barely more than a whisper. I will make a full confession, he said, not to protect Margaret or her daughters, but because the pretence has become unbearable. 50 years of maintaining the lie, of knowing what I did, of allowing an innocent woman to be destroyed while I ascended to prominence and respectability, the weight has become impossible to sustain. If prosecution of Margaret Ashworth will result in exposure of my own crime, then I accept that consequence. Justice delayed is justice still owed. Poirot nodded slowly, his expression reflecting a kind of profound satisfaction, not at the sight of suffering, but at the emergence of truth from beneath decades of concealment. The investigation had evolved beyond the simple theft of a jewel into something far more significant, the exposure of family cruelty and the assertion of human dignity in the face of systematic deception. As Lord Ashworth prepared to offer his confession formally to Inspector Webb, a commotion erupted from the Manor's entrance hall. A constable rushed into the drawing room, his uniform dishevelled, his expression registering profound alarm. He carried urgent correspondence sealed with an official government stamp. Monsieur Poirot, the constable gasped. A telegram has arrived from Scotland Yard. There has been a development regarding Viscount Marlowe's medical condition. The poison administered was not aconite, as the village physician believed, but rather a sophisticated compound requiring specialised knowledge of toxicology and continental pharmaceutical practices. More significantly, the poison was not meant to kill. It was designed to induce unconsciousness precisely calculated to prevent Marlowe from testifying about the true circumstances of the jewel theft. Inspector Webb's confusion deepened. But Madame Ashworth has confessed to orchestrating everything, including the poisoning. Has she? Poirot's eyes narrowed with sudden intensity. He turned to address Margaret directly, his tone carrying the razor-sharp precision of a man identifying a fundamental inconsistency. Madam, you are an educated woman, trained in secretarial and administrative work during your years of exile. Yet the poison administered to Marlowe required knowledge far more specialised than that which any ordinary person would possess. Who truly prepared this toxin? Margaret's composure fractured visibly. Her gaze shifted toward Adrian Voss, then back to Poirot, her expression betraying a truth she had attempted to conceal even within her confession. Adrian, she said quietly. Adrian prepared the poison. He believed it necessary to protect Eleanor's identity and ensure her safe departure. He acted without consulting me, without my knowledge or approval. When I discovered what he had done, I could not betray him to save myself, not after 50 years of his devoted protection. Adrian Voss rose from his chair with theatrical resignation, yet his expression suggested neither guilt nor remorse, rather a kind of philosophical acceptance that his role in this elaborate scheme had always contained the seeds of its own undoing. The poison was indeed my creation, he acknowledged, but not for the reasons Madame Ashworth has stated. Viscount Marlowe represented a liability that extended far beyond his knowledge of Eleanor's identity. He possessed information regarding another matter entirely, information that would have fundamentally altered the investigation's direction and exposed a truth far more damaging than the theft of a ruby or the exile of a woman. Poirot's eyes gleamed with the recognition of approaching revelation. Explain yourself, Monsieur Voss. What information did Marlowe possess? Voss moved toward the window, his gaze fixed upon the snow-covered gardens beyond. 50 years ago, when Margaret was exiled and forced to surrender her children, one element of the arrangement was never disclosed to her. The child she believed had been placed with me, the boy she mourned as lost to her forever. He was not truly my foster son. He was the illegitimate child of Lord Ashworth himself, born to a servant girl during his youthful indiscretions. Margaret was made to believe the child had died in infancy, but in reality Lord Ashworth arranged for the boy to be raised under an assumed identity, provided with education and social position sufficient to establish him as Viscount Marlowe. The revelation struck the drawing-room with the force of an explosion. Lord Ashworth's face drained of all colour. Catherine gasped, her hand moving to her mouth. Inspector Webb appeared momentarily incapable of coherent response. "My God," Lord Ashworth whispered. "The boy was my own son. Margaret's grief, her lifelong belief that her child had perished, it was constructed upon a foundation of lies I had personally engineered." Poirot's voice emerged with quiet precision. "Which means Viscount Marlowe was not merely Margaret Ashworth's nephew, but her biological son. His arrival at the Christmas gathering was not coincidental, but orchestrated by Adrian Voss, who possessed knowledge of this truth and recognised the opportunity to reunite mother and son. The poisoning was designed not to silence him, but to render him unconscious so that his identity could be revealed to Margaret without risk of emotional trauma overwhelming her capacity for rational response. Margaret sank into a chair, her body convulsing with sobs that seemed to emerge from depths of grief she had carried across 5 decades. The boy she had mourned as dead now existed, living and breathing, though rendered unconscious in the village constable's office. "The investigation," Poirot continued, addressing the assembled group with the gravity his words demanded, "has revealed not one crime, but layers upon layers of deliberate cruelty, each more damaging than the last. The question now becomes not what justice demands, but whether justice itself is capable of adequately addressing harms of such magnitude and complexity." The manor fell into a silence so profound that it seemed to absorb all sound, all motion, all capacity for further revelation. Poirot stood at the centre of the drawing-room, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his expression reflecting the weight of truths that transcended legal categorization and moral judgment alike. "Inspector Webb," Poirot said quietly, "I must inform you that the official investigation into the theft of the Crimson Star has reached its conclusion, though not in the manner anticipated by conventional criminal procedure. The jewel was stolen deliberately, yes, but not for personal enrichment. It was taken as a mechanism through which to expose a family's accumulated deceptions spanning 50 years. Webb's frustration manifested in barely contained agitation. "But monsieur, crimes have been committed. Theft, attempted murder, conspiracy. These are matters of law, not philosophy. Arrests must be made, prosecutions must proceed. Must they? Poirot's interruption carried the gentle firmness of a teacher addressing a student's incomplete understanding. Consider what prosecution would entail. Margaret Ashworth, a woman robbed of her children and her dignity, would face imprisonment for orchestrating the recovery of stolen assets from the family that destroyed her. Adrian Voss, whose only crime was love and the protection of innocence, would face charges of attempted murder despite administering a poison designed specifically not to kill. Eleanor and Sarah Ashworth, whose sole objective was the establishment of their legitimacy and rightful inheritance, would be branded criminals for actions undertaken in pursuit of basic human dignity. Lord Ashworth rose from his chair with visible effort, his entire bearing transformed by the crushing weight of accumulated guilt finally made manifest. "I will not permit my family to suffer further consequences for crimes I have committed," he declared, his voice carrying unexpected strength beneath its tremor. "I am prepared to offer a full confession to the authorities. The theft of jewels from the British Museum, the manipulation of my sister's exile, the concealment of my illegitimate son, the systematic destruction of Margaret's maternal rights, all of it was orchestrated through my deliberate deception and the corrupt use of family influence." Catherine approached her father, her expression reflecting the complex emotions of a daughter witnessing her parents' moral collapse, and, simultaneously, his redemption. She did not offer comfort, but neither did she turn away. Her presence represented the possibility, however tenuous, of eventual reconciliation. Poirot retrieved the wooden soldier from where it had been placed upon the drawing-room table. He held it before the assembled group, allowing his gaze to encompass each person present. "This toy," he explained, "was the investigation's most crucial clue, yet it eluded proper interpretation until the final moments of revelation. It was carved by Adrian Voss 50 years ago, given to young Margaret Ashworth as a symbol of hope during her darkest hour. It was recreated decades later and left at the scene of the theft as a message, not to confound the investigation, but to signal that the perpetrators understood the true nature of justice being served." The second wooden soldier, discovered in Lady Ashworth's chamber, represented the completion of that message, that Margaret Ashworth's daughters had claimed their rightful inheritance and their rightful place within the family structure. Inspector Webb attempted to regain official composure. "The law requires that perpetrators be held accountable, Monsieur. Personal motivations, however sympathetic, do not supersede the authority of legal prosecution. The law," Poirot interrupted with uncharacteristic sharpness, "is a human construct designed by imperfect individuals to address the consequences of human imperfection. When the law itself becomes an instrument of injustice, when legal procedure serves to perpetuate suffering rather than alleviate it, then the law itself requires examination and, occasionally, transcendence." He turned toward Margaret Ashworth, extending the wooden soldier toward her with ceremonial reverence. "Madam, your vindication has been achieved. Your daughters have reclaimed their rightful place. Your son, Viscount Marlowe, will awaken from his artificially induced sleep to discover that his true mother has been restored to him. The ruby, though technically stolen, now represents the tangible evidence of your family's legitimacy." Turning to address the constable, Poirot gestured toward Lord Ashworth. "Inspector Webb, I suggest that Lord Ashworth's confession be recorded and transmitted to the appropriate authorities. The crime that initiated this entire cycle of deception, the theft from the British Museum 50 years past, falls beyond the statute of limitations. However, the subsequent manipulation of legal processes, the orchestration of false exile, and the concealment of legitimacy may yet constitute prosecutable offences. The decision regarding prosecution rests with institutions beyond my jurisdiction." As the constables prepared to escort Lord Ashworth for formal statement, Adrian Voss approached Poirot with extended hand. The Belgian detective accepted the gesture, recognising in this moment the acknowledgement of two men who had manoeuvred through moral complexity with precision and purpose. Justice, Poirot said quietly, has been served not through the machinery of law, but through the exposure of truth. The Crimson Star remains technically stolen, yet it has restored to 3 women their rightful inheritance. The investigation concludes not with satisfaction, but with the recognition that sometimes the greatest mysteries reside not in criminal methodology, but in the depths of human capacity for both cruelty and redemption. The snow continued its silent descent as Christmas morning broke over Ashworth Manor, transforming the grounds into a landscape of pristine white that seemed to erase the previous night's revelations beneath a blanket of seasonal indifference. Poirot stood alone in the library, examining the leather journal Margaret Ashworth had entrusted to his care. His expression suggested contemplation of matters extending far beyond the immediate resolution of the theft investigation. Inspector Webb entered with visible discomfort, his official authority having been undermined by the complexity of circumstances that defied conventional legal categorization. He carried a telegram from Scotland Yard, its contents clearly troubling him sufficiently to warrant interrupting the Belgian detective's solitude. "The message concerns Viscount Marlowe's condition," Webb explained, extending the telegram. "He has regained consciousness. The medical examination reveals no lasting damage from the poison. Adrian Voss's calculation regarding dosage proved precise. However, Marlowe has made a most unusual statement. He claims to possess no memory of the past week. His mind has apparently retained the trauma induced by the poison, resulting in complete amnesia regarding all events subsequent to his arrival at the manor." Poirot accepted the telegram and examined it with careful attention, his eyes moving across the words with methodical precision. Yet something in his expression suggested that this development, while potentially troubling to ordinary investigation, possessed implications that aligned with patterns he had already anticipated. "Curious," he murmured, returning the telegram to Webb. "A man regains consciousness, but loses his recent memory. The poison administered by Adrian Voss was calculated not merely to render unconscious, but apparently to induce selective amnesia regarding the very period during which his identity as Margaret Ashworth's biological son would have been revealed. How convenient that the human mind should respond to pharmaceutical intervention in such predictable fashion." Webb's confusion deepened. "Are you suggesting that Monsieur Voss deliberately engineered this outcome? That the amnesia was not an accidental consequence of the poison, but rather its deliberate objective?" "I am suggesting," Poirot replied carefully, "that Adrian Voss is considerably more sophisticated in his manipulation of circumstances than even the most astute observer would have anticipated. Consider the implications, Inspector. Viscount Marlowe awakens with no memory of learning his true parentage, no recollection of the emotional trauma such knowledge would entail, no capacity to testify regarding the conversations and revelations that occurred during his unconsciousness. He exists in a state of innocent ignorance, protected from knowledge that might have devastated his psychological equilibrium." He paused, allowing the weight of this interpretation to settle upon the inspector's comprehension. Whether this represents Adrian Voss's intentional design or a fortuitous accident of pharmaceutical chemistry, the result proves identical. Marlowe's testimony cannot illuminate the true motivations underlying the conspiracy, because he possesses no conscious memory of those motivations being. Disgust. Webb attempted to process this new dimension of complexity, but surely Margaret Ashworth will inform her son of his true parentage. The amnesia cannot persist indefinitely. Perhaps, Poirot acknowledged, or perhaps Margaret Ashworth, recognising that her son has lived his entire existence believing himself to be the adoptive charge of Lord Ashworth, will choose to permit him to continue in that belief. A woman who has endured 50 years of enforced separation from her children might reasonably decide that the revelation of biological connection arriving at such a late stage of life would constitute a cruelty rather than a kindness. The library door opened, admitting Margaret Ashworth herself. Her face bore the visible evidence of a night spent in profound emotional processing, yet her bearing maintained the dignity that had characterised her throughout the investigation. She carried a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, which she extended toward Poirot. "The Crimson Star," she said quietly. "Eleanor and Sarah have agreed that it should be returned to the family, not as restitution for theft, but as acknowledgement that genuine justice sometimes requires the restoration of stolen dignity rather than the recovery of material possessions." Poirot accepted the parcel with ceremonial reverence, yet his expression suggested that this gesture represented merely the surface layer of a far more complex understanding. "Madame," he said thoughtfully, "I must ask one final question, and I require your absolute truthfulness in response. When Adrian Voss administered the poison to Viscount Marlowe, did he act with your knowledge and approval, or did he undertake this action independently, believing himself to be protecting you and your daughters?" Margaret's hesitation extended for several seconds, an eternity in matters of such moral significance. When she finally responded, her voice emerged barely above a whisper. "I do not know, Monsieur Poirot, and I suspect that neither does Adrian. The poison was prepared, the opportunity presented itself, and the action was taken. Whether it represented deliberate conspiracy or spontaneous protective impulse has become impossible to distinguish. Perhaps that ambiguity represents the investigation's final mystery, the question of whether our most noble motivations and our most cunning deceptions are truly separable at all." Poirot smiled enigmatically, a gesture suggesting that Margaret Ashworth had articulated a truth that extended far beyond this particular case into the fundamental architecture of human behaviour itself. As she departed, he gazed into the library's fireplace, where the wooden soldier, that curious artefact that had guided the investigation from its earliest moments, cast dancing shadows against the flames. "The mystery concludes," he said to himself, "yet the questions it has raised will persist long after the snow melts and Christmas becomes merely another day in the calendar's progression. Justice has been served, truth has been exposed, and yet somewhere within the manor's hidden passages and secret chambers, I suspect, other mysteries await discovery. Other truths lie buried beneath layers of deception, waiting for the moment when circumstances align and another investigation becomes necessary." Outside, the snow continued its relentless descent, erasing footprints and concealing evidence. Nature's own conspiracy of silence against the human compulsion to expose and explain.